Greetings and salutations, guys. Welcome to another Sunday stream in which we talk about our topic of the month. Now, our topic of the month this month is technology and magic. And just before I go any further, I would like to warn you all that Discord has just had some updates. So you may need to refresh the page if you can hear us but not see us. And if you can see us and not hear us, well, I can't help you. Good luck, people. Good luck. That's all I can say. So we are talking magic and technology. And of course, I have come through for you with an amazing guest, Brian McClellan. I know, guys. I know. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you very much.
We are so honored to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us. Guys, if you don't know Brian, he is the author of the massively acclaimed Powder Mage series. But let me introduce him properly very quickly. Brian McClellan is an American epic fantasy author from Cleveland. I happen to know that he studied also with the great Brandon Sanderson and is of the, I like to think of it as like Renaissance painting houses. So it's like of the school of Sanderson, of the school of Rembrandt, that kind of thing. So Brian McClellan, of the school of Sanderson, but of course his own unique and fascinating and wonderful writer in his own right, is known for the acclaimed Powder Mage series Universe and essays on the life and business of being a writer. Look, guys, this is good stuff. You need to go check this out. He now lives on the side of a mountain in Utah, which sounds extraordinary, with his wife, Michele. He writes books and nurses a crippling video game addiction. My God, I think we are all with you. Brian's novels include the Powder Mage Trilogy, Gods of Blood and Powder, and the Valkyrie collections. We're going to be learning more about this in a minute. You can find him at brianmcclellan.com. You can catch him at Brian T. McClellan on Twitter, and you can go buy his books. I happen to know that one of our amazing moderators is throwing some links in the chat right now. Ooh. So hopefully you can check those out. And I happen to know we can get signed copies from you, can't we, Brian? From your website.
You can, yeah. People from the UK might blanch at international shipping.
yeah, it's brutal.
Not a lot I can do about it, but but anybody in the US, it's much cheaper. So signed copies from my website.
Very exciting. And you do a D&D show, don't you, as well? Typecast RPG. Tell us a bit about that.
I do. Yeah, no, it's it's basically me and a bunch of author friends.
All right, cool. Do you want to drop some names?
So Dan Wells is our DM. Dan is known for the I Am Not a Serial Killer series and a movie that's on Netflix. I think it's still on Netflix, which is stupidly good. And then there's Charlie Holmberg, who is another one of Brandon's writing what children, I guess. So like Charlie's like
of the studio of Sanderson.
Right. She's my writing little sister. And then we've got Mari Murdoch, who does a bunch of tie-in fiction. And she's written for Legend of the Five Rings and a few others. I was talking to her yesterday about this, so I can't remember what she already has out and what I'm not allowed to say is under contract. So I won't say anymore. But she's awesome. And then Howard Taylor, who does the webcomic Schlock Mercenary, which is fantastic, very fun. And Ethan Sprout, who is actually an academic. He teaches science fiction and fantasy and
nice
stuff. And so yeah, we've got a fantastic kind of layout with just a bunch of authors that we just get together and we play, and we kind of created the world together. We're playing in D&D. But it's a homebrew world that we all kind of put together, and it's just a whole bunch of fun. So that's fun.
That sounds amazing, guys. You can catch that on twitch.tv/typecast RPG, or you can get caught up on their YouTube channel, which is being copied into the chat as we speak. All right, but we are here, of course, to talk about world building, magic, and technology. It is a meaty subject, and I cannot wait to hear what you have to say, because I know that there's a lot of these kinds of interactions and this kind of stuff within the Powder Mage universe. I have read Powder Mage 1. I have not got further yet, only because of lack of time.
They're very large books.
They are fat fantasy, and I love it. I love me some fat fantasy. So let's start with this. You have several different universes going on. So you've done this, you've gone through this several times. How do you personally, like your own method, get started with magic and technology in those universes?
So it's kind of hard to say, because when you go at world building, you're gonna start off. Every author is gonna start in a slightly different place. There's gonna be the authors that will start with characters and no world. They'll say, "Oh, I want I'm gonna start with a police sergeant, and then I'm gonna try to build a world around that character that I've already developed in my head that I love." And there's other authors that will say, "Oh, I'm starting with a magic system, and I've come up with this cool magic system." For instance, like mine is Powder Mage, which is mages who snort gunpowder to gain magic powers. And then build a world around that. And basically, however you do it, the way you're going to, you'll start with what you love or what you've already developed, and then you kind of build upon that. And you're gonna, at least the way I do it, is I extrapolate. I say, okay, this is what the character I want, or this is the magic system. What is the world that exists around it? And a huge part of that's going to be technology. And most epic fantasy has always been very kind of a quasi-medieval thing going on, where it's all, you can't really pin it down to a century, because it's so, it's got that weird, there's knights, but then there's also there's technologies that didn't exist when knights actually were there.
Right. It's a hodgepodge of like the early modern world with Renaissance stuff and medieval stuff and some random classical stuff thrown in occasionally, and it's like the greatest hits of history, essentially. Rule of cool.
And we can get away with that because we're writing secondary world fantasy,
right?
And which is a huge amount of fun. There's always going to be limits to that, though. Even though, like, one of the hard limits that I had always heard before I did Powder Mage was, kind of the gunpowder technology. Even though we know that gunpowder existed centuries and centuries before what we think of as the age of gunpowder,
right?
And could easily slide into most epic fantasies technologically, but they just most authors just kind of ignore it.
Right.
Someone will sprinkle a little in there, or make references to it, things like that. But you just kind of ignore it, and which works, because when you're creating a world, you want to focus on, like you said, the rule of cool, and you want to focus on what people, on the story, on what's happening in the middle here, and you see a lot of, especially like bigger epic fantasies will. I'm gonna go ahead and call out Jordan because he's so big that
do it. This is a safe space. We can critique people and still love them, right?
Right, of course. And I mean, Wheel of Time was like, that was the middle of my teens, was Wheel of Time, just in love totally. But you look at his stuff, and it gets so big that he starts grabbing bits of technology and history and just kind of winging them in there just for fun, and then building the whole sections of books around. I'm trying to think, was it Matt who was working on gunpowder during the middle of the books? I don't remember, like, it's been a decade since I read the books, but so you, a lot of these bigger ones, you'll kind of see authors just kind of, get into a slog where they're just grabbing everything they like. And I've been totally guilty of that. But when you're looking at world building, especially with something smaller, I say smaller, like my first trilogy is still 500,000 words. But when you're looking at something smaller, it's going to be, you need to focus. You need to be tight about what you want to care about, and what you want to bring to the attention of the readers. And so, for me, the whole aspect of technology with the magic or versus the magic, that was like a central theme of the book. Because I mean, Powder Mage has 4 different magic systems, which I do not advise. It's a terrible idea.
We will talk more about that later.
But the three main magic systems that I had in there, I very specifically set up from the beginning to be a old school nobility magic system, to be a kind of a commoner magic system, and then a magic system that kind of represented the advancing technology and the rising middle classes and things like that. And because my world was set in its own industrial revolution, very 1800s vibe, early 1800s, late 1700s vibe to it, that worked. And that bringing attention to that was very much on purpose and very much part of the world building rather than a distraction from the world building.
Absolutely. So you introduced it in a way where it was very focused on the themes that you were discovering in the book as well, and exploring in the book as well. Things like old school versus new school, things like technology versus the old ways.
Yes. So that's kind of, I feel like I've been rambling on the original question here, but I do that a lot. So, but that's kind of how I think about it in terms of world building, is what do I want to focus on? What are the readers going to question? So if I'm designing a magic system or a world with particular constraints, I don't need to just kind of do whatever I want. Right. I also need to think a lot about, when a reader is reading it, what are their questions going to be? If I bring up it's the smoking gun, was the Chekhov's gun?
Chekhov's gun, yeah.
Chekhov's gun. If there's the Chekhov's gun, if I bring something up that is a really obvious question that half of my readers are going to say, "Oh, I wonder where he's going with that," and then I don't go anywhere with it, then I failed as a writer.
You betrayed a promise. Yeah,
right, exactly. And so that's a big part of the world building and creating constraints around how my world interacts with itself, which goes back to technology and magic. Technology, especially for somebody like me who is writing an industrial revolution, that's going to be way more important to an author that's working on that time period, or a replica of that time period, rather, than an author who kind of does that quasi-medieval where, it's 800 years of whatever just kind of thrown together. It's way more specific and way more important to the story, because I'm drawing attention to an industrial revolution is all about this advancing technology and how the world is changing, and how it just affects everyone.
Sure.
And you take something something as simple as the steam engine, which I don't get into in my books, but you take that and you look at how it changes the world in 50 years, like a very short period of time. Then you're gonna need to focus on that if that's the part of your world that's important. Trains, things like that. I very purposefully came in a little bit before that in terms of what I was aiming for a technological level. And because I didn't want to deal with that. I didn't want to deal with the trains and steam engines and all the implications. And I also didn't want, because when you get into steam at all, there's already a very established subgenre of steampunk.
Right.
And that I don't know that genre at all. I know it has all of its own things, but I didn't want to touch that. I didn't want to get into that and feel like I needed to delve into the steampunkish sort of the trappings, basically.
Right, exactly.
What people will expect from me writing in that subgenre. I wanted to create something a little different and a little new, and with kind of this flintlock fantasy is the term that I'm not sure if he coined it, but it's the term that I heard from Brent Weeks first, when he blurred my book, which was really cool. Which flintlock fantasy isn't new. Like there have been flintlock fantasy books over the last 30 years. As Lee Modisett reminds me every time I'm on a panel with him. I wrote that 25 years ago.
Hipsters doing it before it was cool, right?
Right. But that's kind of like individual little snippets, little examples. Whereas I kind of was lucky enough to get in right at the beginning of a genuine subgenre kind of explosion, which you see a lot of now. Django Wexler's first book came out 2 months after my first book, and and he's a fantastic author. He kind of it was funny because I was very worried when I heard that he was writing Flintlock fantasy based on Napoleonic kind of themes and feels. I'm like, oh crap, we're coming out at the same time, and this is going to be really awkward and weird. And then it came out, and I read the first book, and it was just as different from my books as any quasi-medieval fantasy is from another quasi-medieval fantasy. And and then I've seen a lot more of that kind of stuff coming out over the last few years, and it's been really cool to see, and very fun. And my next series is still going to be Flintlock fantasy. It's cool. It'll be a total departure from Powder Mage, but it's still going to have that feel of early 1800s.
Very cool.
And but now, especially with that being more of a thing, and people trying to blend genres more and do new things, I think we're going to see a lot more of that idea of technology and magic either coming into conflict or rising together or changing the world, things like that. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in epic fantasy over the next decade.
Yeah, definitely. So just to recap some of the points that you've made there, you really thought a lot about the kind of story that you wanted to tell and the kind of themes you wanted to explore when you were building your technology and magic, which is super cool. The other thing that I love that you brought up, so I'd like to extrapolate for our audience to some points from that, because there's so much gold in what you just said. That you deliberately excluded things that were outside the scope of what you wanted to deal with, which is absolutely as important as what goes in the box, what goes outside the box. What do you not want to deal with? What is outside the purview, at least for now, at least for this book or this D&D campaign or this whatever, that you do not want to explore? Because that is really freeing as an author or a DM, just to be like, this thing over here, this bugbear, not looking at that, but I am looking at this. And it really means that you can double down on what you are doing, and you can bring that out in so many more different ways and not get sidetracked on that other thing that you knew already that you didn't want to deal with. So that's amazing. And that's a really good guide for anyone who is starting a world, or for anyone who is, working with technology and magic and trying to bring that into a world, into a novel, into a campaign. So my next question, and this is one that I am super excited to ask, because it's one that I think everyone has another answer to, and we can learn so much from it. Describing things that don't exist. We are talking about magic, of course, which arguably does not exist in this world. I'm not going to have that discussion. But how can our world builders start with descriptions of things like magic or incredibly advanced technology? How do we describe something that we've never seen? How do we create that for the reader?
See, that's just writing books, creating something new that, it doesn't exist. It's so for myself, I use a lot of techniques to introduce the reader to the world. And this doesn't just apply to the magic, but to everything in the world building. There's a few different ways. One of the big things that I know, like Brandon talks about in his lectures, is the Maid and Butler dialogue. And this is the thing you want to avoid, but which is also a really good tool if used right. If you can do a cheat to get around this. The idea of Maid and Butler dialogue is that you've got a maid and butler, and they come in and talk about. One says, "As you know, Lord so-and-so is doing this and this and this," and the other one says, "Oh, that's because this and this and this," and it's just really obvious kind of
expo dump. Yeah, fast expo dump, but clunky.
Right. Now, there's cheats for doing exactly that without making it look like you're doing exactly that. One of those cheats, which I use a lot, is to have a sidekick character who doesn't know as much about what's going on, who doesn't know as much about the magic or as much about the politics or whatever. And that way you've got two characters that can naturally talk about something. that the reader needs to know about. And that's a really common thing. That's very it can border certainly on Maid and Butler dialogue, and you do want to you want to edit it well, basically. But it's a really good technique for getting information to the reader without stopping and explaining things.
Yeah.
I have a scene that in my very first book, Promise of Blood, I remember, because I have so many freaking magic systems in that book, I remember my editor coming back and saying, like, near the end of what we were working of edits, coming back and saying, look, you have not explained this other magic system very much. You've been very vague about it. And so I ended up putting in a scene where the main character, or one of the main characters, goes to a library and is searching for books on sorcery.
I remember that scene.
Because he is not he is a knacked, which is a minor sorcery that gives him perfect memory. But he does not know that much about the two bigger sorceries. And so he literally goes to a library and he's trying to find out more. And so he has a brief discussion with, I think it's the librarian or one of his friends or something like that. It's been a long time since I read the book. But he has a brief discussion with that character that sketches things out. Now, if I remember right, 7 years after I last read the book, I do border a little close to Maid and Butler dialogue. Probably because it was late in edits and I was just trying to get the stupid thing back to my editor. But it's an example of being able to have a conversation that there is a reason in world for that conversation to happen,
Sure.
which is really important. And that's how you get around Maid and Butler dialogue. Because Maid and Butler dialogue it hinges on the fact that there's really not a reason that these two characters would have that conversation, because they both already know the information.
Absolutely. It's something that Mary Colwell describes as you know, John. And it just feels super awkward. And as you're reading it, you're like, it's horrible. And you're absolutely right. That's a super important thing and a great way to do exposition. I was thinking more in terms of, with this question, things like, how do we start to build descriptions of these things? How do we start to explain to our audience, what does it look like? What does it smell like? These kinds of things that are important for sort of immersion, essentially.
Right. And that gets down into, technique, as an author, which is something that I don't necessarily think about nearly as much as a lot of authors do. But it's actually something I'm working on myself. So the way I would put it is that so back to what I was saying before, just slightly, is that you have to, you're building a world and you're trying to do a narrative in which the characters live in that world. They know what's going on to a certain extent. They know most of the rules of the world, but the audience doesn't.
Right.
And that's where those two things kind of come into you're trying to weave this thing, where you're not doing Maid and Butler dialogue, for instance. But you are creating a picture for the reader. And that's just that's just straightforward description. One of the things I struggled with early on a lot was trying to describe things that had really easy analogs in the real world. So like saying, well, this thing's kind of like a car,
right?
Where it's really easy. It's tempting as a reader, as an author. And this is a thing I did when I was 17 and I was trying to write stuff, where you kind of throw in an author aside almost, and you don't want to do that. It doesn't work. That's very, it just, so you have to try to get into a character's mind and give a description from their point of view that would be easy for somebody in our world to understand, because you want to give a good enough description that the reader says, oh, it's like a car, but that you haven't told them that.
Right.
And that can be really tough, but it's about word choice. Word choice is something I think about quite a lot because of the time period I write in. There's a lot of technology that existed in the early 1800s that we don't think of as existing in a fantasy world. And so word choice comes into it for me because an example, I was thinking the other day, in fact, I asked a question on Twitter of, what would they use, what would people in the early 1800s use for sound dampening? And I got a bunch of good responses, things like cork and velvet, thick cotton, and rubber and asbestos. And the thing is you look at rubber and asbestos, those words don't belong in a fantasy world.
Yeah.
And that's tough. You're like, this totally works for what I'm looking at, and it works for the time period of technology, but in the reader's head, those words are going to say, oh, they're going to break them out of things.
Yeah, they're immersive breaking, essentially.
Yeah, even though they're simple and they're applicable. And that is, so that's what not to do, basically, is to, you have to keep your eye out on these word choices and figure out a way to, like, I haven't actually decided what I'm going to use for that thing. I might use asbestos, but try to come up with a different name for it or describe it rather than actually using the word asbestos. You can do workarounds. You can, describe something that the reader might or might not make the link, but because you haven't used a keyword that makes them think real world, you've gotten around it.
Cool.
So creating is, it's one of those, I feel like I'm skirting your question.
It's a hard question. That's why I asked it, because I thought it would be interesting.
It is a really hard question. It's something that I kind of do naturally. And I'm not saying this to be like, oh, I'm an awesome writer. I'm trying to say that because, I've been doing this for a living for, 7-8 years now. And so it's something that I do without thinking about. It's something that you kind of have to learn the techniques very early on to make those descriptions, to make things feel both recognizable but otherworldly.
Yeah.
Because you want the reader to feel immersed in something that isn't the real world, but you also don't want to lose them. One of my big rules is to not throw a bunch of proper nouns at them in the first chapter.
Right.
If you throw 30 proper nouns that all have apostrophes in them, the readers, their eyes are going to glaze over, and there's nothing.
They're shutting that book. Yeah. If there's too much, they don't know what it is, and it's not readable. And I have to pile on here. I'm dyslexic, so if I see too many words that start and finish with the same letter, those are the same words for me. Because I read word shape rather than word letters. I know it sounds silly, but a lot of readers, particularly readers who read quickly, will also have that. They're shutting that book.
Right. And that's just, it's varying things up. That's like a whole different discussion. The techniques to doing different lengths of scenes and chapters, and using and not using the same word a bunch of times in the same paragraph. That's a whole different discussion. Like you were saying, it's a tough question. This idea of how do you describe something that doesn't exist it's imagination. It's, you think of, if you're trying to describe something that's like a car but not, yeah, it's like, I don't even know how to verbalize it. It's such a weird, it's imagination, and if you don't have the imagination to be able to do that, then you're kind of up shit creek as an author.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I do think, fair listeners, do not despair. It is something that you can develop over time. So do not feel, if it's something you struggle with, do not feel that you can't be a DM or you can't be a writer. It's absolutely something that I think you can develop over time, but it's tough.
And the thing is when we talk about something like being a DM, like I feel like, depending on the type of DM you are and the type of world you're doing, being a DM, I feel like it's way more acceptable to stop and be like, yeah, it's kind of like a car, and just tell your players that, it's a car with wings. I don't know, something like that. You can stop as a DM and just say that to your players. And, like I said, depending on the type of DM you are and the type of players you have, some will object to that. But you can get away with doing stuff like that. When you are fully immersed in a narrative, like a book, secondary world, unless your main character is from our world, which is another great way of getting around things, then yeah, you're gonna need to come up with those descriptions.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we are going to hop off. When we come back, we will be talking about the do's and don'ts of world building technology and magic. I cannot wait to hear what Brian has to say about that. In the meantime, guys, this would be a great time to get your questions in. You can ask those by writing in capital letters question and then your question, so that our moderators can see that, get that to us, and we will be answering those questions in about 10 or 15 minutes. So guys, we will be back in a couple. See you soon. Bye. And we are back. Hopefully. Yes, we are back. Quick, Brian, say something.
Hi.
Yes, good. Your microphone works. There we go. You know what they say? It's not a World Anvil stream unless we have some audio issues. Oh, yeah. Okay, so when we left, I promised you that we would talk about the do's and don'ts of technology and magic. So, Brian, tell me, are there any don'ts that you found when writing about technology or magic? So what things really don't work for you?
So I touched on this a little bit earlier. The idea of figuring out what you're not going to include. It's and this is a very basic writing thing, not just a magic and technology thing. But if you have a world in which there's only swords and then, like elemental magic or something like that, and then during the climax, one of the characters pulls out a gun, you need to have a really good excuse for that. You need to have laid the groundwork for a gun to exist in the world. And that applies across anything where you're going to have very differing technology levels, and you want to introduce something that's high technology into a low technology world, and so, because you can always go down. If you have a science fiction book, or whatever,
a high technology level or whatever.
Yeah, a high technology level. You can always have a guy with a knife, or a club. That's very basic stuff. You can always go down, but going up, you have to have a reason for it within the narrative. And so having a flying car suddenly show up, where is it from? Why is it there? What is your explanation? And it can't be like a one-off. You can't say, oh, a flying car arrived, and then given us a lengthy explanation of some lost city that has flying cars and how they're coming to help. And then the rest of the book, there aren't any other flying cars. You've got to have a reason for everything you do in a book.
I guess that's the other side of Chekhov's gun in a way. Like,
yeah.
if you put it in there and don't use it, your audience is going to be like, I want to know what's going to happen with that. And on the other hand, if you use it and haven't foreshadowed it, that's sort of the other side of Chekhov's gun, if you see what I mean, where like it doesn't make sense, and why is it there, and this thing feels really disjointed.
Well, and the most famous example of that is the Eagles in Lord of the Rings.
I thought they were going to come up.
Why didn't they just go and drop the stupid ring? Or why didn't they carry Frodo to drop the stupid ring? And we can extrapolate reasons. Oh, the Nazgul had big flying thing dinosaurs. Whatever. You can come up with reasons, but that's a big question mark to most readers. Now we let it go because it's Tolkien and it's just great in general. But kind of modern readers, they are, because of like Tolkien bringing a question like that up, modern readers are going to think that question. They're going to think, why is this bit of technology that you introduced here, why does it not apply to the rest of your magical world? And the same thing works within a magic system. If you do something with that magic system and then don't ever do it again, why?
Right.
And so that's a big don't for me, and that's just a narrative, world building, etc. That's a very broad brush to paint, but applies especially to technology, especially in a world that I create. In like my Powder Mage stuff, it's if I introduced a steamship, I would need to give reasons why there aren't more of them, or why the characters aren't taking a steamship this other time that they need to get somewhere fast, things like that.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's flip that question on its head. Are there any do's? So factors that have become very important about when writing about magic or technology, things that you absolutely need to think about, steps you need to go through, or facets that you always think that you should explore when talking about magic or technology?
Those, there's a lot of those. It's going to be, the starting one is going to be, you need to figure out early in your planning process as the author, how much does this magic affect society? How much does it affect the world around it? Is this a magic / technology that is only available to the very richest or the most powerful? Do regular people even know about it? Is this a thing that's common? Is it ubiquitous? Is somebody in a magical world going to see a particular technology and go, oh yeah, that's normal? Or are they going to go, ah, and run away?
Right.
Because they think that it's a demon or something. I don't know. But what are the repercussions of your magic and your technology throughout the rest of the world? And kind of, and that's part of basic world building, but it's also something that I also kind of put a stop on that. Like I think that you definitely need to do that, but you also, if you spend 2 years of your life trying to go down the rabbit hole of how your magic affects every single tiny bit of society, you've wasted your time.
There's a name for that. It's world builder syndrome, and it's to be avoided at all costs.
Yes. Now I have the opposite of world builder's disease, which is that I underworld build everything. and that's actually like that I did, especially in Promise of Blood, where I had a bunch of really cool ideas. And I did do a lot of world building before Promise of Blood, but I also did a lot of it on the fly. And that's something that I'm actually, now that I'm really designing my next big epic fantasy world, it's something I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to figure out how technology and magic affect society in a way that's not as narrow as I kind of stuck with for Powder Mage. I tried to keep things very narrowed into what applied to the narrative, and that was part of my anti-world builders disease, was that I was only doing what applied to the narrative.
Right.
Because as you're doing it on the fly, you don't really care about what's happening over here.
Right.
But I'm trying to be better about that. I've done probably more world building on this next universe, and I'm only a fourth of the way through the book, the first book. I've done more world building on this universe than I did at probably all of Powder Mage.
Exciting.
And I did 6 books. So it's about, yeah. So that's kind of my big. It's that's almost a do and a don't. It is, do figure out how the technology and the magic interact with each other and with society, but don't get so bogged down in trying to extrapolate every single little tiny thing that you don't actually ever write the story.
Right, absolutely. And there was just one other point that I wanted to make when you were talking about, thinking about how your magic and your technology can affect things. You kind of have to think like a cunning bastard. You have to be sneaky, and you have to think, how is somebody going to take advantage of this? How is somebody going to manipulate this for their own goals? Because in my mind, and you can call me a pessimist, that is the most realistic way that you will see your magic and technology proliferate through the world. How can somebody make money from it? How can somebody get gains from it in some way or another? And that's a very good way to start approaching how is it going to proliferate through your world? How is it going to interact with things? Is what benefits can it give to an individual?
Right. Like one of the things I did when I was at the very beginning of my world building for Powder Mage was I have one magic system that is it is an elemental, very classic sort of hand wavy, explodey magic sort of thing, and they're called privileged sorcerers. And these privileged sorcerers have been around for all of human history, and they're basically a secondary nobility. They're just so powerful that these these cabals of sorcerers, they're advisors to the king. They're practically nobles unto themselves. They have tons of money and influence, all this stuff. And then I took the powder mages themselves, which are integrated in technology by by snorting gunpowder to get their magical power. And I said, okay, a powder mage, they get powers from snorting gunpowder. They're faster, they're stronger, they can think quicker, they can see further, all of their senses are heightened. But against a privileged sorcerer, that sorcerer is just going to turn them into a smear on the ground. However, a powder mage can also shoot a gun, a flintlock musket. They can shoot that from a mile away, and so if they can put a bullet in the head of a privileged sorcerer. And so it was taking a technology, a newer technology, and even though it wasn't as classically strong, it nullified the advantage that this older, stronger, more powerful magic had. And that was a really big part of the essence of what I was going to write about for 6 more books, was this kind of conflict between a technology that had magic linked to it versus something that's only magic.
Right, absolutely. So I think we should jump to our audience questions, or I think question, because you guys have not been asking so much. However, Maticus Guy asks, how far do you extrapolate those alternative technical paths? This from earlier when we were talking about, extrapolating your technology, figuring out what level it's at, how far does it integrate within society, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
I'm working up a Baroque clockpunk setting, and the idea of creating an internally consistent world is really fascinating, but oh so very daunting.
Right. And that is like I was saying before, it's actually a question you need to ask yourself. Because if like when I wrote Powder Mage, I very specifically was writing a book that I wanted to finish the book, send it to agents, get an agent, get a publisher, have that book be the start of my career. That's what I was writing that book for, and nothing else. Like,
Mm.
uh, there are a lot of writers out there that don't get talked about that much. A lot of writers who are writing for themselves. They're writing because they find it fun. They like the mental games they get to play and the puzzles they get to solve. And so if you're the type of writer who is writing for yourself, then do it as much as you want. You know, create as big of a world with as in depth of a, you know, of extrapolation as you can possibly do over the next 20 years. You know, that's great. If you're writing for publication and you're really trying to keep things tight narratively, um, then extrapolate to the point that the story needs it. You will having something like a beta reader, having people that are willing to look at your book. You know, if you're willing to try your friendships enough that you make all of your friends read your books, then people and you yourself can do this as well. People are going to find gaps. They're going to find little places where you didn't extrapolate enough, where a question mark shows up in their brain as they're reading, and they say, "Okay, but if the world's like this, then why didn't this particular thing happen? You know, why wasn't this particular piece of technology used or this bit of magic used to solve this problem?" Or maybe in this world, if it's internally consistent, it's that there should not be a problem. You know, this problem that they've introduced is a false problem. It should be, you know, it's the cell phone thing. You know, if everybody, if half of the people on TV would just pick up their cell phone and call somebody, so many things would get taken care of. You know, and so you've got to look for the big glaring errors like that. But if you're writing for publication, uh, you want to be you want to be thorough enough, you know, and that is a really hard line to say where it is.
Mm.
You want to be thorough enough that the reader does not scratch their head, that they don't say, "Huh, what? Why? What's going on here?"
Yeah.
Um, but you don't want to be so thorough that you waste huge amounts of your own time, and you're creating these little spider webs that go so deep into your universe that they're never going to come up and they don't matter. And if you want to do that, it's great. It's fine. Um, but think about what your personal goal as a writer is, and where you're trying to go with that. An internally consistent world, you know, like I was mentioning, like I had a problem with that for Promise of Blood, my first book. There are a few bits and pieces inside Promise of Blood that are totally not consistent. Um, I got away with it because of the rule of cool, because they looked cool, because they felt cool, and they felt like they fit kind of. And so people, occasionally somebody will say, "Oh yeah, this thing doesn't feel like it fits," and I'll say, "Oh yeah, you're right," because I try to be very honest with myself as a writer. Uh, you know, and but then the subsequent books, you'll see with like Crimson Campaign and the books that follow, I try to be far more consistent, and I try to take the world that I established in Promise of Blood and stick to the rules that I had created. Um, and and that's all. That's me trying to be a better writer. You know, it's and you're you have to remember you're writing for an audience. And that's kind of the end of it, is that once it's out of your hands, you can't have readers coming back to you and saying, hey, you did this wrong. And your responses are either, well, you're not reading very well, because that totally happens all the time, where readers will say, yeah, you did this wrong. And I'll say, but it's explained earlier in the chapter. Yeah, work on your reading comprehension. So that's definitely a thing, but you try not to be smug about it. But you also have people come to you and you can just say, well, yeah, you're right. I screwed up here as the author. And so keeping things tight is how I like to do it. But yeah, it's your own personal choice, and if you are writing for publication and you're just going everywhere, you're shooting off in every direction, and you do get an agent or an editor, they're going to look at you and say, yeah, please tighten this up. None of this stuff that you mentioned in this chapter actually matters to the story. It's cool world building, but make it move the narrative forward.
Right, exactly. And you know what? World Anvil exists. You can always put in the end of your book, for the full world, go check out worldanvil.com/yourworldhere, whatever it is. That stuff isn't necessarily lost, but if it doesn't need to be in the book, don't put it in the book, and don't feel like you need to create everything. I think that's really important. Don't do a Tolkien, don't get lost in your world building. Create what's necessary for your end product, whether that's a campaign setting or a book, whatever it is, but don't feel the lure of the rabbit hole. And if you want to write yourself notes, write notes, that's fine. And then just, I had an idea about the origin of this. Great, write a quick note. That's all you need. Do not drive yourself crazy with this. Yeah, I think you're absolutely on the money there, Brian, with that. To Rika.
Okay,
sorry.
I had a real quick. I want to share a really dumb anecdote.
Right.
So my next universe is based around an industrial magic that is created. These little baubles that are created that basically enhance your natural abilities.
Cool.
Depending on what the magic is that's kind of mixed in with the glassmaking process. Anyways, so this is applicable to the rabbit hole of where you're not gonna use it. Is that I've got these little baubles, this glass that can be made to enhance people, and I had somebody ask me, well, what is this was like a few months ago when I was talking about it on a panel. I had somebody ask me, okay, what's a thing in that world that you're never going to use? And it just jumped right into my mind. Oh yeah, people would definitely have sex toys made out of this. And it's just it's a thing that will never be mentioned in canon, because that's not the kind of book I write.
Right.
But I kind of think it's hilarious. But it's definitely would be a thing, because that's just how humans are.
Funnily enough, somebody mentioned in the chat as well, when I was talking about think about personal gain, think about these things, somebody was like, there would definitely be pornography of something or other, which incidentally is something that I loved about Blade Runner, is that you get these sort of weird sort of sex places, pornography places, which makes total sense.
Right.
And particularly for that kind of gritty, edgy cyberpunk world, obviously they wanted to play that up. But it honestly, you see it now with sex bots. The minute that we have that kind of technology, somebody's like, I want to have sex with it.
Well, that in the Blade Runner sequel, the companion, I don't remember what it was called, but the little companion thing he had, it was so incredibly humanizing. It felt so real to what it means to be human and to be lonely and all of that. And that's an instance where that bit of world building, incredibly necessary and incredibly fantastic to developing the main character. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tirika asks, what do you think about the side effects of magic / technology, like radiation or pollution with technology, or magic corruption magic corrupting people, or maybe burning the user from the inside, or all of these other sort of tropes that we see with this kind of thing. How would you approach something like that?
Read my next series.
Boom! There we go.
It's actually very applicable because I have basically what the magic system I just described. It has levels. It's called resonances. So you get these little magical baubles, this stuff. It's called God Glass. And you have low resonance, medium resonance, and high resonance. And basically all of this magic that it gives you strengths and powers and the ability to, think faster and, be stronger, and it changes kind of who you are when you're exposed to it. But being exposed to it also slowly kills you. It's like radiation. And so low resonance is something that everybody has access to. It's very cheap. Everybody can get it. It gives you a little bit of a boost, and so and it also, you probably will get cancer when you're old, kind of thing. But medium resonance is a boost up from that. It's more expensive, it's harder to get, but it also makes you, it's much better, and it affects you in a far stronger way. But if you use it for a couple of days, you're going to start throwing up, and you're going to feel sick. It's going to take you a week to recover.
So it's very caustic on the body, yeah.
Right, it's caustic on the body. And then high resonance is basically you can use it for 2 minutes, and then it might kill you. Like, it's just, but also for those 2 minutes, you will be superhuman in some way. If you have a piece of purple God Glass, you're going to be a human computer. You will be able to make every calculation that you have information to make. But if you use it for longer than a minute or two, it's going to turn you into sludge. And so that's an example from something I'm literally working on right now. It's a thing, I think Brandon Sanderson actually has a lecture specifically on this. It's the consequences of magic.
Interesting.
What's the backlash? What is it that makes magic hard to use, or makes it so that there's some kind of a consequence that's gonna what price do you have to pay to make this magic a thing? And so that's the price I'm looking on in my world. And because it's a magic that's accessible to everyone, the special people in my world are basically people who are resistant to this magical radiation. They're not immune to it, but they can use God Glass for far longer periods of time than normal people can.
Interesting.
And it's a kind of an innate ability.
So do you think that's something within your approach that you would recommend? So having a set of penalties which then perhaps some other people don't experience?
Well, and that's a very common thing in kind of magic development, is saying, what's the consequence? And you don't necessarily have to have a consequence, but you have to, unless your world is a place where magic is everywhere and everybody can use it, that's totally a thing. You can do that. But unless that is the case, you need to have reasons why magic is not everywhere and why it's not being used to solve literally every problem.
Right.
And that includes having consequences, or having it so that only certain people can use the magic in the first place, or making it so that the magic is very difficult to tap into. There's lots of ways to go at that, but it's just kind of what your choice is as the author.
Fantastic. So, Secondhand asks, let's do this one very quickly. Secondhand asks, do you ever time jump a few generations in your own setting to see where magical technology might develop to?
I have been asked this actually quite a lot because Powder Mage, gunpowder, using gunpowder and stuff. People will say, "Oh, what happens when the chemical makeup of gunpowder changes?"
Right.
Things like that. No, I haven't. because it's not a story that I'm working on. You know, if I decided to tell that story, then I would definitely do it. But like I said, I tend to be a very focused person on my world building, even though I'm trying to be better. I tend to be very focused, and so I don't really ask questions that don't apply to stories that I'm immediately working on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fair enough. All right, Brian, I have one final question for you, which is, would you like to reveal anything else about Godglass? I have been wanting to ask so much about this. That's the name of your new trilogy, I think, isn't it?
So it's not the name of the new trilogy. It's what I'm calling it because that's the main magic system.
Sure.
So
WIP title. Yeah, I get it.
Right. It's work in progress. So we haven't announced it yet. I will say the contract is signed. I will not say with who because we haven't made an official announcement. The first book I think is slated for 2022-ish. So it's going to be a few years. Yeah, so it's a flintlock fantasy world in which the magic system is industrial. It is. I wanted to explore a world in which magic was kind of like oil or concrete or some other very integral piece of technology is to us, where it's just everywhere. The magic is accessible. Anybody can use it, but like I described the consequence before, it is you have to be rich to get the good stuff, and there's there's a backlash. There's a reason to not be using it all the time. So the world is very. It's funny because the magic system is only about. It's less than a year old.
Huh.
Yeah, the magic system is less than a year. It's about a year old. Where I've been working on it, but the world itself I've been working on for like 3 or 4 yees. And this goes back to one of our earlier questions about kind of the order of things of developing. I've been working on this because I originally envisioned it as an epic fantasy political thriller, and then my agent said, "Please don't do that. That sounds super boring." But I've been building kind of the trappings of the world based a lot on. I'm combining the British Empire of the early 1800s with the thuggish, very that kind of criminal nature of the Roman Republic, and it's super fun. I've really been enjoying it. Like I imagined, kind of the British Empire, except if somebody could totally get stabbed on the steps of Parliament, and that would be a normal thing.
Sure.
So I've been creating this kind of world around it, and then the magic system has been built up over the last year, and I'm now working on it full time because I'm done with all of my other projects.
Exciting.
And I signed a contract, so I have to be working on it.
There we go. The magic of contracts. Amazing. Well, guys, you can find more about Brian at brianmcclellan.com, or you could go find him on Twitter at Brian T. McClellan. You could, of course, buy Powder Mage on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. But if you go to his website, you can buy the signed Powder Mage trilogy that is available. And I think that our moderators will throw the links for all of that in the chat. If you fancy catching up with Brian's Dungeons and Dragons show, you can do that too. He plays at Typecast RPG, which is twitch.tv/Typecast RPG, or you can find him on YouTube to catch up with everything that has happened already. Brian, thank you so very much for coming to join us today. You've been just a mine of useful information.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it, letting me ramble on and just keep on chatting.
Oh my gosh, it's such a pleasure. And guys, I will reveal that I spoke to Brian in the break, and I said, Brian, would you like to come on and talk to us about writing tips and craft and this kind of things? And he said, yes, guys. So now he has to do it because I've told you. This is how I do it, Brian. So I get you back.
My pleasure. I would enjoy it.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I have thanked you. Thank you so much, of course, to our incredible moderators and producers who have been helping me throwing up questions, letting me know that I'm live and have sound, which is always a very valuable thing to know when you are live, that you have sound. I would like, of course, to thank everybody in the chat. Thank you, everyone who asked questions. Great questions today. Thank you for the follows to Yashira72, Mysterious Stranger 645, to Kitty, to Tenbatsu Z, to Little Soul, to Sawazan, and to King Bashma. Good name, good name. Thank you to for the bits, Basic Dragon, and Basic Dragon, making it rain in the chat there. You amazing fiend. And for the hosts, Hefe Live, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you and the Hefflings. Right, we are going on a raid. Well, guys, we are going to raid Legends of Avantris. They are a live play RPG game. You should absolutely check them out. Our raid for our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. Make sure you shout that out to let them know that we sent you. We have one final question for you, Brian.
Yes.
Powder Mage RPG. When?
It's been out.
It's out. When do we found it?
You can find it on DriveThruRPG.
Boom.
And you can also find it on my website. PDF Boom. Or signed copy from my website, or from, I think there's a print on demand at DriveThruRPG. So it's just literally nice. Google Powder Mage RPG and it's there.
Can I ask why you're not doing your Powder Mage RPG on Typecast RPG?
Because the idea of playing in the world that I've created, it's like nails on a chalkboard.
Yeah, fair enough.
It sounds terrible, but it's the same thing. Like, I can't listen to my own audiobook, even though the audio reader is amazing. It's so weird to be to do that kind of thing. So that's what I get it. All right, guys, we will catch you next week when we will be talking one more time about magic and technology, and have a great one. Bye bye. Oh, I forgot to say, grab your hammer and go Worldbuild.